Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Senator Elizabeth Warren are pushing President Biden to forgive $50,000 in student debt from each borrower in the United States. So let's talk about what exactly is going on here, some facts and statistics around student debt forgiveness. I'm really going to dig into the research here. It is worth a watch. And let's talk about whether this is actually feasible to do or not. We're going to present the arguments on both sides. That way you can formulate an educated opinion as to what's going on. And this should be the only video you have to watch on student debt forgiveness, and you'll understand the full picture. So just to start off, let's start with a quote from Senator Warren. She says, "An ocean of student loan debt is holding back 43 million borrowers and disproportionately weighing down Black and brown Americans. Canceling $50,000 in federal student loan debt will help close the racial wealth gap, benefit 40% of borrowers who do not have a college degree, and help stimulate the economy. It's time to act. We will keep fighting." Now, I wanted to read that quote just because it allows me to make a couple important comments. So just a few comments on this. First off, I was surprised to see such a high number, 43 million Americans who hold student debt. That's such a high percentage of the adult population. And then digging into that a little bit further, I found that the average amount of student debt held in the US by each individual who holds student debt is $32,731. That's more than the median American's income in an entire year. It's also shocking to hear that 40% of people with student debt don't have a degree. Now, this makes me wonder if there's some kind of more deeply rooted societal issue here where everyone is pressured to think that college is the only option. I mean, I remember being in high school and feeling like that's the only option. And if it wasn't for sports, I probably wouldn't have been that interested in college because I wanted to be an entrepreneur my whole life. And then I went to college and I was thinking, this really isn't for me because I'm going to leave college and start a business anyway. So do I delay that or not? And I ended up dropping out of college. Now, this isn't to say that it isn't for everyone or that I'm against college, because there's obviously great opportunities there and certain areas that you just absolutely need to go to college. But to make it feel like everyone needs to go seems a little bit wrong to me. And the fact that it leaves all these people with this massive debt burden. I mean, 40% of those who hold student debt don't have a degree. So this isn't the first time that student debt forgiveness has been brought up in the recent past either. Last summer, we saw a proposal for $30,000 in student debt cancellation. Just a few weeks ago, we saw a bill introduced that's trying to push that same exact $50,000 figure. I can pull it over to an article on this real quick. We can see Schumer, Warren introduced bill calling on Biden to wipe out student debt. And there's a good quote here from Chuck Schumer, who says, "We are not going to let up until we accomplish it, until $50,000 of debt is forgiven for every student in the country." So I thought, that was kind of interesting as well. Biden's response to all this is that he's prepared to write off $10,000 in student debt from each borrower, but not $50,000. He doesn't say exactly why. It might be a debt reason, it might be some other reason. Right now, the White House is reviewing whether this is even possible for President Biden to sign an executive order that would forgive $10,000 in student debt from each borrower. This seems kind of tricky to me because I know it's typically difficult for an executive order to pass anything that needs funding, because funding typically goes through Congress. I mean, for example, when Trump passed an executive order that gave funding to unemployment boosts last summer, he had to take funding from FEMA, which is emergency funds, in order to fund that. So there was kind of a workaround there, and there was still debates as to whether that should be doable or not. So there's also the possibility of a president signing an executive order to forgive student debt and then Congress vetoing that order. However, that's more unlikely with a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate. Also, doing some just napkin math on this, if Biden were to forgive up to $50,000 in student debt for each borrower, that would cost about $1.4 trillion. So almost the size of the entire next stimulus package. That's $1.9 trillion just to forgive student debt, which is, of course, a mind-boggling large number. If you were to forgive $10,000 per borrower, it would still cost $430 billion for those 43 million Americans who hold that debt. So either way, it would be a massive spending bill to make this thing happen. That would be, of course, opposed by moderates and conservatives. The arguments against this are that it would increase inflation more. It would set a standard that these debts are just always going to be forgiven for the next generation of people. And of course, it would add to the federal deficit. Now, I did some real deep digging on this to see what the research says, because you can always find opinions on each side of the spectrum, and it's hard to know what exactly is the the right opinion. I mean, even with economists, you can find opinions far on each side of the spectrum. So I always try to find studies, if possible, that are actually researching these things based on models and not just opinions, looking at facts. So I really did some digging here, and I read through some research articles, found some studies that base predictions of what would happen if student debt was forgiven in economic models. So, and also just a heads up, these papers are based on complete student debt forgiveness like forgiving all student debt, not the limits of either 10,000 or 50,000. So we're looking at between like 40 and 80% student debt forgiveness. So you can kind of factor that in as I'm talking about the results when we go through these studies. So the first study I found is called The Macroeconomic Effects of Student Debt Cancellation. Every study has just a crazy title that sounds so scary, but then once you start reading, they're really not that bad. So it starts talking about how the increased demand for college credentials combined with raising costs of attendance to college has led more students than ever to take on student loans, which isn't a surprise to anyone, with higher than average student loan balances. So the combination of social pressure to get a degree and tuition costs is making loan costs just skyrocket. And they go on to say there's a ton of social benefits to having citizens with higher education, including human capital accumulation, which is basically the growth of wealth through investments, social mobility, which is someone moving up the socioeconomic ladder, getting more wealth, going from lower class to middle class, something like that, and greater tax revenues and social contributions that flow from a highly productive population of people who are more educated. However, there are, of course, negative effects as well. Here's a stat that I found. Every 10% rise in student loan debt reduces the home ownership rate by 1 to 2 percentage points for the first 5 years after leaving school. Another study titled The Impact of Student Loan Debt on Small Business Formation, which I thought was really interesting as a small business owner myself, states that high student loan debt dampens new business formation and just dampens overall entrepreneurship because people are less able to take risks if they have this financial burden that they need to pay off every single month for years. So the paper says there's a negative relationship between student loan debt levels and small business formation. And this amounts to a 14% decline in new businesses in countries where student loan debt is the highest. Then the researchers say if student debt is dampening household economic activity, we can expect that forgiveness of the debt, would produce a net stimulus effect. But now the question is, what kind of stimulus effect? Is it worth the amount of money that's spent on the program and added to the deficit? So the researchers use both the Moody's and FAIR models, the economic risk models, which are like the gold standard for economic models, to make predictions on what the economic effects would be of this. And here are some of the highlights of the paper. So of course, you don't have to read this like 50-page research paper. So the simulations state that debt relief could boost real GDP by an average of $86 billion to $108 billion per year. So we can factor that down a little bit because this, again, is complete student debt forgiveness. So we could say, 40 billion to maybe 70 billion per year. And this is because money is freed up and people just have more funds to spend elsewhere. Forgiveness also would reduce the average unemployment rate by 0.22 to 0.36 percentage points over a 10-year forecast due to things like entrepreneurship, just more money flowing that can go to businesses and hire more people, things like that. And this would create more jobs with that same positive entrepreneurial effect, with 1.2 to 1.5 million new jobs created each year. So this is great and all, but there are still additional consequences that I want to talk about that are shown with these simulations as well. But they're actually not as bad as you would expect, or at least not as bad as I expected. So in the FAIR model, inflation peaks at about 0.3% and then turns negative in later years. So they're saying inflation goes up, but then due to the positive results, it actually has a negative inflationary effect in the long run. And then in the Moody's model, the effect is even smaller of inflation at 0.09% inflation in the short run. This pressure would also lead the Fed to increase interest rates a little bit, but they would increase them by around 0.3% to 0.5% in the short term, with longer increases about half that much. Which, right now would be a large increase relative to what interest rates are at currently, but still small relative to just normal, interest because interest rates are so extremely low right now. And that's going to do it for everything you need to know about student debt forgiveness, the facts, the figures on both sides, so you can formulate a more educated opinion as to how you feel about this subject matter. If you appreciate me reading through these research studies, consider liking the video and subscribing if you haven't already. And if you're a super fan of my efforts, consider becoming a channel member by clicking that join button next to the subscribe button. So I'd like to thank you for watching, and I hope you have a profitable day.